Today, we're taking a close look at Myanmar following that terrible earthquake.
Yeah,
And the sources we've got, they go way beyond just, the collapsed buildings. It looks like a really complex humanitarian crisis, layered with some pretty deep emotional stuff, too.
that's right. What really struck me is the range. We have these like big picture questions
Right.
about the overall impact,
Uh-huh.
but then also these incredibly vivid personal stories.
Hmm.
Survivors talking about, their daily struggles, what they're afraid is coming next. It paints a very full, maybe overwhelming picture.
Yeah, overwhelming is a good word. So what we want to do is try and pull out the really crucial threads from all this material for everyone listening.
Exactly. It's kind of distill it down.
And we've seen some key themes popping up again and again, haven't we?
Definitely. They're all interconnected.
We've got the immediate crisis shelter, obviously,
Yeah.
then food security, which is huge.
Huge.
The emotional and psychological toll,
Hmm.
that's massive. Economic hardship, loss of jobs, and then this really difficult layer of political repression kind of woven through it all.
Yeah, that adds such a complex dimension.
But it's not all completely negative. We're also seeing these incredible stories of community resilience, people helping each other.
Absolutely. That's important not to lose sight of.
We also need to think about the hidden costs, maybe the things you don't see right away, what we can learn from past disasters, and ultimately sort of the call to action, right? What does this all mean?
Right. Where do we go from here?
Okay, so let's start with the absolute basics. Shelter.
Yeah, the sources just hammer home how severe the shortage of safe housing is, people forced out of their homes.
And nowhere safe to go.
Exactly. And it's not just about, a roof, it's about security, especially with aftershocks being a real threat.
Right.
It really brings up that question of responsibility, doesn't it? Who's supposed to ensure people have adequate housing? Is it the aid groups, local government, the international community?
It's a huge question. What have we learned from past quakes about what actually works for providing shelter long term? Or maybe where we failed?
Well, that's the thing. These temporary shelters, the sources suggest they're often just not enough.
Not enough against the weather or another tremor.
Precisely. We're hearing about people in, like, makeshift tents or trying to live in buildings that are already damaged and unsafe.
You can just imagine the constant fear, the anxiety.
So what kind of planning needs to happen now to get beyond these, Band-Aid solutions?
Yeah, are these really just temporary stopgaps, or is there a danger they become the norm for months, even years?
That's the risk.
Yeah.
Because without that stable base, that secure home, how can people even begin to think about rebuilding their lives or their communities?
It can't. It's foundational, isn't it? If you're worried about where you'll sleep tonight, everything else feels impossible.
Exactly.
And that leads straight into the next basic need.
Yeah.
Food and clean water.
Yeah, the earthquake obviously just shattered access to those things. Supply lines completely disrupted.
So the immediate challenge is just getting those essentials flowing again.
That's priority one, according to the sources. But we also need to look ahead. What are the long-term consequences going to be? Food insecurity, especially for kids, the elderly.
Malnutrition, long-term health impacts.
Yeah.
Physical and mental.
Right. And we know from other disasters, if farming gets disrupted, that could destabilize things for years.
Yeah.
Are the sources giving us a sense of how bad that disruption might be in Myanmar?
They do mention local markets trying to get going again, people trying to adapt, set up stalls where they can. That resilience is there. But the big question is it enough? Can these local efforts really feed everyone who needs it, especially over the long haul? What kind of outside help is going to be essential?
And that's where partnerships become critical. How do the big aid agencies work effectively with those local groups?
Right, not just imposing solutions.
Exactly. Ensuring food gets distributed fairly, transparently, reaching remote areas, avoiding any kind of discrimination, building that trust is key.
Definitely. And, underlying all this practical stuff, the physical rebuilding, the sources are just full of the human cost, the emotional impact.
Oh, absolutely. It's profound. You read the descriptions from survivors. That initial shock, the sheer terror of the event itself.
And the potential for really deep, lasting emotional scars.
Yeah. How do you even start to address that kind of widespread trauma, the pain, the anxiety? It's become part of daily life now for so many people.
Yeah.
Are the sources pointing to specific mental health issues that are coming up a lot?
Well, there's the constant fear of aftershocks. We mentioned that. But layered on top of losing your home, maybe your job, maybe people you love, it's almost unimaginable.
The cumulative weight of it all.
Yeah. And one source put it really powerfully, saying the cries you hear aren't just about losing stuff, losing property. It's the shattering of memories, of a whole way of life.
That sense of place, of normalcy just ripped away.
It's like losing part of your identity.
That's a really important insight. And the sources talk about prolonged depression setting in. People who've lost jobs, homes. Their whole sense of purpose is gone.
Which just highlights how vital things like trauma counseling are, right? It can't just be an afterthought.
Absolutely not. It needs to be front and center and culturally appropriate too.
It makes you wonder about the community support systems that were there before. Were they strong? How have they been damaged?
That's a good question. Can those networks be rebuilt or adapted somehow? To provide that kind of emotional first aid, help people find some stability again, maybe drawing on traditional ways of coping too.
Yeah.
The language in the sources is just stark. Things like hollow eyes, disbelief, sorrow, people clinging to memories. It really paints a picture.
It does. And that feeling of the familiar world suddenly becoming this like nightmarish landscape.
Yeah.
That surreal feeling must leave a deep mark.
Oh, definitely. And then there's the issue of survivor's guilt, which the sources mention.
That must be incredibly difficult to carry.
Yeah, and that state of shock. It can just wear down resilience over time. It becomes this cycle.
And the kids? We have to talk about the kids.
We do. The sources talk about the stealing of innocence.
Mm-hmm.
Kids having nightmares, sleepless nights. Those images of destruction just burned into their minds.
That kind of early trauma can have such long-lasting effects on their development, can it?
Absolutely. They need specialized support. They're incredibly vulnerable in this kind of situation.
One source described it as feeling like sinking in quicksand of sorrow. And that idea of it being a cross-generational thing, the weight is just immense.
It really is.
And then piled on top of all that, you have the economic devastation, the loss of livelihoods.
Yeah, the earthquake just wiped out so much of the economic landscape. Businesses destroyed, huge job losses.
And it's not just the money, is it? The sources talk about the hidden costs.
Right, the loss of self-esteem, the way it can fracture communities when lots of people are suddenly unemployed, losing your ability to provide. That hits hard, way beyond the finances.
So we need to be thinking about things like, what? Job retraining, microloans for small businesses, direct cash support.
All of the above, potentially. It's about helping people regain some independence, rebuild with dignity, not just handouts.
And this seems like another area where we could learn from past disasters, right? Are there economic recovery models from other earthquakes that might work in Myanmar?
That's a key question. How do you foster more resilient economic systems that can maybe better withstand future shocks? Because this won't be the last disaster, unfortunately.
No. And the sources really stress how important regaining that dignity of work is, its purpose, its contribution.
It absolutely is.
Seeing descriptions of small shops just reduced to rubble, artisans, farmers, shopkeepers losing their income overnight, it makes the scale of it very real.
Yeah.
And the loss of hope that goes with it.
Yeah. Work gives structure, connection, identity. Losing that is profoundly destabilizing, especially on top of everything else.
Okay, so we have the physical destruction, the food crisis, the deep emotional trauma, the economic fallout, and then we have this other incredibly difficult layer, the political situation, the role of the junta.
Yeah, this is where it gets really complex and, frankly, disturbing. The sources raise serious allegations about the junta interfering with aid distribution.
Which is just awful to think about, that political control could actually be making the suffering worse for people who've already lost so much.
It's hard to comprehend. But it's not just potentially blocking aid. The sources suggest this disaster might even be used as a pretext, an excuse for increasing state repression.
Wow. Okay.
That adds a whole different kind of fear and vulnerability for survivors.
Yeah.
How does that political climate affect the recovery efforts we've been talking about? It must hinder things terribly.
It really complicates things for the international community too, doesn't it? How do you even operate in that environment? How do you make sure aid actually gets to the people who need it without being manipulated?
It's a massive challenge. This combination, a natural disaster hitting a place already under tight political control, it's a toxic mix. The sources hint that people might be experiencing more trauma because of the repression itself.
The idea that a natural disaster could be exploited to tighten control? It's chilling.
It is. And it raises those tough questions about accountability. If power structures are misusing the crisis, what can be done?
Especially when, as the sources note, the earthquake itself might be providing cover for it.
And there are reports mentioned of heavy-handed tactics, controlling aid, cracking down on any dissent. It paints a picture of a regime maybe prioritizing its own power over people's survival.
So for someone who's lost their home, their job, they also have this constant fear hanging over them of the authorities, arbitrary orders, violence.
That's the oppressive atmosphere the sources describe. It must be an almost unbearable level of constant anxiety.
It's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
But even with all that, the sources also talk about collective healing, about community resilience.
Yes. And that's so important, that sense of solidarity, people coming together. It's a vital resource, both for the physical rebuilding and for healing those emotional wounds.
And it seems like a lot of it is grassroots, local leaders, neighbors just stepping up.
That's what comes through strongly. These local initiatives are crucial.
And it's not just about handing out supplies, is it? The idea of using community counseling, maybe traditional healing methods, creative stuff like art or stories, that seems key for deeper healing.
Totally. Finding culturally relevant ways to help people process everything and sharing survivor stories themselves. Those narratives of resilience can be incredibly powerful. They inspire hope.
Within the community and maybe beyond, internationally.
Both. They remind us of that human spirit, that strength, even in the face of, well, unimaginable loss.
It must be complicated, though. When everyone around you has also suffered loss, how does that affect healing together? Does it help or make it harder in some ways?
That's a really nuanced point. Shared grief can bond people, but it can also be overwhelming. What steps are needed to really nurture hope when the future looks so uncertain?
Because the sources mention that too, people helping each other, yes, but also this deep anxiety. Will the aid keep coming? Will the rubble ever get cleared? Will they ever have political freedom?
Exactly. That contrast is there, incredible moments of heroism and community shining through. But alongside this pervasive uncertainty and fear, still, that resilience is a powerful force.
Definitely. Okay, let's shift slightly to what the sources call the hidden costs, beyond the obvious destruction.
All right. The things that aren't easily counted, like collapsed buildings are. The psychological scars.
What do we even measure that? The long-term impact of untreated trauma on a whole community.
It's incredibly difficult. But the sources rightly point out that the implications are huge. Widespread trauma can affect community health, stability, everything for years to come.
And you have to wonder about the physical health links too, right? All that chronic stress and anxiety, it must take a physical toll eventually.
No doubt. Which is why prioritizing mental health support in the relief programs is just non-negotiable. It can't be secondary.
Are there innovative ways mentioned to help people process grief, rebuild trust, feel safe again, especially given the context?
The sources touch on the need for creative, culturally sensitive approaches, yes. Because it all comes back to that compounded suffering we talked about.
The disaster plus the political situation.
Exactly. That constant uncertainty, the lack of control, it creates this immense psychological weight. It likely leads to more anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD.
So it needs a response that sees all those layers, not just the earthquake damage in isolation.
Precisely. A truly comprehensive response. And looking forward, the sources push us to think about lessons learned from the past.
Yeah, comparing this to other major earthquakes or crises globally seems important. What can we learn from how those were handled?
What worked, what didn't? How have past global responses, the good and the bad, maybe shaped what's happening now in Myanmar, and what gaps are still obvious?
It seems clear from the sources that survivors themselves and local groups have to be central to rebuilding. It can't just be outsiders coming in.
Absolutely vital. Empowering local communities is key for any kind of sustainable recovery. Rebuilding not just buildings, but a supportive society.
And thinking really long term, what kind of policies or safety nets could help stabilize things, both economically and in terms of mental health for the future?
How do we build back better, essentially? Build more resilience into these communities.
And could this collective trauma, horrible as it is, actually become a catalyst for positive change somehow?
That's a powerful idea. Can it push innovation in disaster management, community support, maybe even more sustainable development?
It's a challenging thought, but maybe a necessary one, to look for potential transformation even amid such suffering.
It is. And that really leads us right into that final theme from the sources, the call to action.
Yeah. Are we, the global community, are we really listening? Do we understand what people in Myanmar are going through? And what can we actually do to help now and down the road?
The sources really stress how important international media and advocacy groups are. Keeping this story alive, keeping it in the public eye long after the initial shock wears off.
Because the attention fades so quickly, doesn't it?
It does. Sustained attention is crucial.
And what about governments, big aid organizations? What are their responsibilities here? Not just for immediate relief food, shelter, but for that longer-term recovery, including the emotional healing part.
How do we get better at mobilizing resources? Faster, more efficiently, making sure they actually reach the people facing hunger, homelessness, despair. Are there systemic changes needed in how aid works?
And what about us as individuals? What can we do? Advocating for policies, supporting the right organizations, ensuring that basic needs, shelter, food, and mental health support are seen as essential human rights in any crisis.
The sources make that plea, don't they? Look beyond the statistics, the headlines, see the faces, hear the stories, connect with the shared humanity.
It really boils down to a tough question, doesn't it? Are we actually ready to stand in solidarity? Not just with the earthquake victims, but understanding the whole picture, the politics, the economics.
And are we ready to push for those deeper systemic changes?
Mhm.
The ones that support rebuilding lives, healing trauma, not just patching up buildings, especially when it's politically complicated.
That's a serious challenge to us all.
It really is a call for reflection and hopefully meaningful action.
So, wrapping up this deep dive on Myanmar, it's just incredibly clear how complex the situation is, this web of challenges.
Yeah, the physical destruction is immense, obviously, but then it's compounded by the food insecurity, the deep psychological trauma, the economic ruin, and all under that shadow of the oppressive political climate.
It's a lot, yet what also comes through so strongly in these sources is that resilience, the human spirit. You see it in what survivors are doing, in the work of local communities, the aid groups on the ground.
Absolutely. Despite everything, that determination is there.
So we'll leave you with this thought, building on that call to action we discussed. Faced with this kind of multifaceted suffering, what does it really mean for us to be global citizens?
How can staying aware, showing empathy, taking concrete action, how can that actually contribute to long-term healing, to real change, even when the politics are so incredibly difficult?
It's something to really reflect on. We hope exploring these sources has raised some important questions for you and maybe encourages everyone to think about how we, individually and collectively, can respond to crises like this.